Affable Life looks at all kinds of things of great interest and passion, and today what I want to talk to you about is something that is of great interest to me, and I have a very interesting person to interview, Austin Mackell. Austin Mackell is a man who is a member of various organisations that support a universal basic income. See that brilliant cartoon that you've been looking at? That was created by John Ditchburn from Ink Sync Cartoons, INKCINCT Cartoons, Ink Synced. And it's a brilliant cartoon, and it shows the horror of what is Centrelink. Now, the government's huge subsidy, its stimulus package that was brought in with COVID-19 is a great thing for the people who've received help. But you know, lots of people haven't. Lots of people have missed out. And the cost of it and the strain of it, working through Centrelink, which doesn't manage the numbers of people it normally looks after very well. If anybody tried to get a pension, anybody tried to get some job seeker support in normal times, it's not easy. And it's designed to keep people out, not to help them. Universal basic income is a wonderful concept, and I think this country not only should adopt it, but had we adopted it at the beginning of this crisis, we probably would have saved billions of dollars. So let's move on to the interview with Austin Mackell. Austin, I understand, is a signatory to a letter that was sent to the Prime Minister's office. There's been many petitions to the government about universal basic income. I hope you enjoy listening to this interview. I understand, Austin, that you did sign that petition and it went to the Prime Minister's office. Is that correct?
Yes, I think it went to the Prime Minister's office and a few other places.
Yep.
I'm a member of Basic Income Australia, and the demand for a basic income, in that case, I think came from the Humanist Societies of Australia, which I was a signatory to.
Great, wonderful. And there's been several, we'll come into that later, but there's been several approaches on this issue over many, many years, actually, going back to, I think, the 1920s. I want to give you an invitation. Talk to me initially as if I know nothing about it. I did hear about it some years ago, and I've been an advocate for it ever since, but talk to me as if I know nothing about it, so our listener who may be in that position can understand.
Sure. Okay, so universal basic income is the term. A UBI is often used, or just basic income. And I mean, we put the U there. It often used to stand for unconditional basic income. And but universal kind of snuck in while everyone was looking the other way or something. And now we all say universal basic income. And it's a payment generally imagined to be from a government to every member of that community. And it happens on a regular, ongoing basis, and it's not means tested, and there's no checking. There's no reason that anyone doesn't get it. Now, some people say that the basic means that it has to be enough to be a livable income. I tend to believe that. I tend to think that because some people say universal basic income is just a payment that goes to everybody. And it doesn't actually have to reach the level of the poverty line or any other sort of threshold of livability. Now, to me, then, I don't know what the basic stands for. And they say, well, it's the first thing that everybody gets. Then they build on that. But to me, you're just saying universal income. And I don't know why we've got the three words there. But a lot of the time it's used to describe any unconditional payment that goes to any member of the community. And there are reasons you might want to do that. For example, if we had a global universal basic income, if we had some, future world federalist arrangement, and there was a global universal basic income, it might not be able to account for all the differences in the cost of living. And it may say, well, we'll pay enough so that the poorest people in the poorest countries, or that you can reach the poverty level in the poorest countries, and we'll leave it to national governments to sort of top that up. So that's one reason it might not be set at a fully livable level, or not a fully livable level for everybody in the community.
Yeah.
But imagining it from a national point of view, people tend to say that the aim should be at least to get it as high as the poverty line, or the Greens have a proposal for universal wellbeing payment. Well, the Illawarra Greens are quite vocal about this. I don't think the national leadership talk about it much. And the Illawarra, their line is the current, essentially the current expanded coronavirus job seeker payment or parenting payment of $550 a week. So, you know,
Just to comment there, sorry. The Greens actually nationally did adopt it as a policy a few years ago. They were belittled for it. But,
they don't seem to, and they seem to have shied away from it even now when the winds of change are blowing and they should be, you know, furling out their sails. They've instead gone for something called a job guarantee, which I'm very skeptical of. And I think it sounds a lot like workfare, actually. Maybe better workfare, but workfare nonetheless. But we'll just focus on, but they do still have it on the books. They're just not making it a centerpiece of their media activity at the moment. The federal leadership aren't saying anything about it because they've decided we need another party that triangulates its message to seem sensible rather than standing up for what it believes in. And it's like, well, if you're going to be that good, just join the Labor Party, guys, right? Anyhow, if you're going to be sort of trying to focus on what's sellable rather than what you really think, then what's the point of you? But anyhow, leave that as that commentary aside. I do support what the Illawarra Greens are pushing. I'm sorry, I can't remember her name right now. There's a woman who's from them who's quite active on this, and she's working with disability advocates and so on why a UBI makes sense to them. And their payment is, you know, roughly $2,200 a month. So, you know, sort of kind of enough to live on in Australia right? People are doing it. And the idea is that would just go to everyone all the time, no strings attached, no means testing. I don't know how they imagine implementing it, but the way people in Basic Income Australia have put it is that if you've got a tax file number and a bank account, you get it, the end. Right? And so there's.
Then the next stage of that, I imagine, is that it's managed by the tax office. So when people put their tax returns in, you know, if you're on a really, really healthy income and so on, you're probably going to be paid back in tax.
That's the idea, I mean, that's how I imagine it. See, not every, you know, it's really this idea that crosses over left and right as well, which a lot of people claim ideas do this. This is one that legitimately does. So Milton Friedman famously proposed a minimum income guarantee, which is similar. It's not quite the same. It's as soon as it would also be administered by the tax office. And it would be that as soon as your income drops below a certain amount, it gets topped up. Or, you know, at the end of the financial year, it gets topped up or anything. And you can even imagine someone else has just said to me, well, what if we just made job seeker automatic and linked it to pay as you go? Right. So we've got PAYG so the tax office knows how much you earned every week already. And when that drops beneath a certain level, job seeker starts to kick in automatically. Now that's already basically creating a minimum income guarantee. And, you know, these things in theory, they're quite different. In theory, unemployment payment is one thing, minimum income guarantee is another, and a UBI is a third, and they're all really different. But if you either zoom in on the details or you stand back and let your eyes go fuzzy, they're all different versions of the same thing. What we're trying to say is no one should be in poverty. No one should be in poverty. No one should be in poverty. The end. You don't have to earn the right to a decent, comfortable life. That is a given. As a member of society, you earn that. You deserve that. And that, of course, is incredibly goes against the fundamental taboo of our society that you have to earn your keep. And I think that we're at the stage now where we've actually got to take that taboo head on.
I'm going to put in a clip of the former Treasurer Joe Hockey in his speech talking about lifters and leaners in that dreadful, dreadful budget. The curious thing is that he also talked strongly about double dipping and all that sort of thing. And of course, he was then rewarded by his party by being sent to the most cushy, the highest paid and the best ambassadorial role in the world, to become the ambassador for the US. So he would have taken his pension money, which is already extraordinary for politicians, and I think his salary from memory was more than the Prime Minister as an ambassador.
We're talking hundreds of thousands
Oh yeah,
a year then, you know.
absolutely.
These people were worried about, you know, someone at the bottom getting, you know, $20,000 a year to live on so that they don't end up homeless, right?
Yeah.
They're all taking home salaries close to $500,000,
Yeah.
right? It's really grotesque.
It really is. It's very sad actually. But when this COVID thing happened and suddenly we had a shutdown to the economy, and I fully applaud what was done in that way, because you know we would be in a dreadful state now if we didn't take those steps, I believe. The government then came in with this stimulus package, which at the time was something like 320 billion, if I'm correct. I did some basic figures after seeing the huge queues, but which anybody would realise was going to happen when suddenly all these people are out of work. They're all going to go to Centrelink. And Centrelink operates to me like a failed soup kitchen, where you actually have to arrive and demonstrate and prove that you have been starving for weeks and you're on the verge of death before you get some soup. Just as an illustration there, I work in disability. I turned 66 in April, so I'm now at my age eligible for the pension. All my work stopped, basically, and as a casual, and I've been a casual in disability work for 8 years. So what that means, what that meant was I started to panic. You know, my wife was working in the same area, and we're thinking, what are we going to do? You know, eat up whatever super we've got, which is not a lot. So I then went through the process to apply for. I wasn't sure whether to go for JobKeeper or pension or whatever. And the process is so difficult. You have to prove all kinds of aspects about your life. And I constantly think, because I've worked in either welfare or support of people who are disadvantaged for many, many years, I always think, how would they manage it? And I know that none of them would. In the last few days, my work has started to come back in disability. I've had to make 2 calls to Telstra to try and sort out phone issues for 2 of my clients. And there's no way that they could manage it on their own. It's made so difficult. So come back to that. So
You're right. It's absolutely a nightmare. We had an investment deal fall apart when the markets crashed, and my wife and I went to go get on Centrelink payments. It took us 2 months, and you know we were spending my dad's super during that period because he had access to his, and then we cashed out our own super, and you know. And all of those things, all of that, the stuff that comes from the tax office happens a lot quicker, if you've noticed,
absolutely.
right? Administration can be done effectively. Now, when it's not moralistic, when it's not about what Centrelink's trying to do is always gouge your intentions, and gouge, you know, the true secrets of your soul. Are you really trying to find a job, or did you apply? You know, how much did you want? That job that you applied for becomes the question. Did you really want it, or was it a fake attempt, right? And then so these job seeker operators have to sort of look into your eyes and understand the true, you know, secrets of your soul. It's anyhow. But at the end of that process, it was only calling up and saying, guys, we have, you know, this much in bills due and this much that we're overdue. They may cut us off, and getting bumped onto the financial hardship line. They got us bumped up and got us paid, right?
Yeah.
And then I can't tell you the change to our stress levels once we were on the payment. Of course, Morrison manages to keep us all on our toes by hinting that they might change the amount at any given second. Don't get too comfortable. We know he's got an announcement coming probably later today about cutting back on some of that stimulus, which will probably be a disaster because the economy's. He's saying you've got to get the economy off out of the ICU, and it's like, well, it's not ready to breathe on its own, and maybe it never will be again. Actually, maybe this is not a temporary thing, but what's happening, and this is what I believe, is that we're going through a period of time where transformations that were already occurring will accelerate. Yep. So things won't ever go back to normal.
Look, I agree with you, and I fear that I had a father who went through the Great Depression. He couldn't go to war because of a leg injury that he had, but he was a banker, and he always talked about what the Great Depression was like. So he was only probably a teenager going through the Great Depression, and all the queues and all that sort of thing. So that's as soon as I saw those queues for Centrelink, that brought back all those memories of those conversations.
On that note, I just have to add something quickly. So we can imagine a better version of the welfare system, yep, where it was more efficiently processed and so on. But even if it was perfect, you still would, when there's a spike in the number of people becoming unemployed, when the rate at which people are becoming unemployed goes up tenfold, yes, or whatever it did, then how can you possibly process it? Unless that process is automated, right? Unless it's an automatic thing, even then there's going to be some lag, right? Because yep, you have to, rent more computing space or whatever. But if you've got enough, if it goes through people's hands and you've got staff and they need to be trained, and you're trained for 100,000 people a month or whatever it is, and then you get 1 million in a month, how can you possibly deal with it?
Oh, you can't.
It's just not, and so this also applies to this idea of a federal jobs guarantee, which the Greens and other people are pushing, because I think essentially they don't quite have the courage to push for a UBI. The idea is that, it acts as an automatic stabilizer, because as people leave the private sector, they get employed immediately and automatically by the public sector. Now, if we're having this much trouble processing people when all you've got to do is check their income, decide they're a real person, and put them on a payment. Imagine when you've got to assess their skills, find them a suitable project to be employed at, find them the right role, get them through an interview. It would be an absolute nightmare. People Absolutely. Would still be, you'd have a lag of months and months before people were actually put to work, and whether that work is legitimate or useful is a whole other question. And in that period, they don't have the spending power, so your automatic stabilizer works fine, except when things get unstable. Yes. It's not much of it's no good in a crisis, which is when you need it most.
Yeah, absolutely. I did some basic figures, and I don't know whether people in your networks would be much more capable of doing it than I. But I did some basic figures than me, but on the $320 billion that was being spent. And I worked took the same parameters of people who were going to be supported and so on in the various ways, and then converted that into universal basic income. So if that had been introduced at that period of time, I believe there would have been up to $100 billion in savings. But not only that, the saving on mental health and stress to the country would have been enormous.
What level of basic income were you assuming then?
Not a huge amount. I think I'd worked at around about $1,000 a fortnight, something like that. So it's not
similar to the universal wellbeing payment.
Yeah,
that the Greens have. Yeah.
And job seeker, like for example, the mentality is the issue. I think it's a belief that the majority of people won't work unless you force them. So you keep job seeker payments, which there've been arguments for years to increase it to a livable amount. And it's been bravely resisted by all kinds of people in government because, you know, if you don't make it difficult for them, they'll stay on it and they won't work. Whereas statistically, there are some people, yes, who will choose not to work given the option. But I believe they're in the minority.
Well, there's a couple of things I'd say there. One is, if we could save 100 billion by just doing a UBI rather than the various payments, then we shouldn't save the 100 billion. We should make the UBI higher.
Oh, I agree.
That's what we should, because I think, first of all, the idea that governments, I'm also a believer in sort of some controversial theories about government budgets and so on. And I don't actually believe that balanced budgets are a good thing. I think a balanced budget or a surplus is by default a bad thing. And people say, so there's the school called MMT, which I don't agree with because, again, because their policy proposal is the jobs guarantee. They're really the driving force behind that. But one of the things that they're saying is, look, what government spending needs to be doing is making sure that the economy is running at full capacity. Right, the balance is not between taxes and spending. The balance is between between overall spending, public and private sector, and the economy's productive capacity. So you don't want too much money coming at the economy from all directions, or you'll get inflation. But if you have too little, then you'll have deflation. Or what we have now is deflationary pressures, which force the central bank to go into negative interest rates. So sort of throw money at the financial sector, throw money at the business sector to try and get them to generate jobs, right? And of course, they can't, because there's no demand in the economy for them to service. So instead, they, especially in the US, would say they take this cheap money and they do stock buybacks. Yeah. Or they do other things where it goes into asset prices. This cheap money, the low interest loans, instead of going into incomes and into consumption, it goes into inflation of asset prices, including housing in the Australian context. So what MMT and I subscribe to something called consumer monetary theory, which is a lot like MMT, but we agree with MMT that people say about this school of thinking, sort of post-Keynesian soft currency thinking. Professor Steve Keen is a brilliant mind in this area. What they're saying isn't that deficits don't matter. It's more outrageous than that. We're saying deficits are good. Deficits are what you want. And if you look at the history of government spending, that's what it shows. Between the 1930s and the beginning of this century, the average for almost all the developed economies was to have a deficit year. They had very few surplus years, mostly deficit years. And what happened? Did the sky fall? No, it didn't. No. Right? In fact, we raised our standard of living. We grew our economies. So this idea about deficits is all wrong and has to be taken head on. I'd say about that, what happens now is that money enters the economy primarily through the banking sector. And so that every time money enters the economy, the bank is charging interest on it. So that means all economic activity is paying this is dependent on debt financing, finally. And what that leads to is a situation where money is always moving overall out of the real economy and into the financial sector. And that's how you get these crises about 2008. And now is not just about coronavirus. It's about these mountains of debt that were in the economy already, and which that debt bubble has popped alongside the sort of genuine economic contraction.
Well, of course, the argument about balanced budgets and so on, I'm not an economist, but obviously the coalition, I think, doubled the debt in the period that it's come into office, and yet the whole time it's been belittling Labor for what it did in the global financial crisis and the debt that it developed.
Yeah. Well, look, I think personal debt and private debt can get too high, and that's part of the
Of
problem is
course it
that
can.
we've
Yeah.
used
Yeah.
we push consumers and businesses into debt a lot of the time, and if we had a basic income, there would be a lot less debt in the economy,
Yes.
and that would be a good thing. But I mean, if the problem is, like, we think about government spending, as if it's household spending, where it is more like business spending.
Yes.
It is more like because many businesses, when they're going through their growth phase, when they're growing, they are spending more than they're taking in revenues,
And they have to borrow to grow.
and they have to borrow to grow. And then they only once they maximize their market share, only once they're already have as many locations as they possibly can have, only once everybody's already got an Amazon account, only once everybody's already on Facebook and there's a cap to growth, do they switch to worrying about profit.
Yeah.
Because growth is more important than margins if you're growing, right? And that's what national economies are like. Assuming that growth is the goal, that's a whole separate question. I believe it should be a goal. I don't think we need to go. I don't think degrowth is the answer to environmental issues. I think we have to decouple economic growth and wasteful resource use. But assuming growth is the goal, then it makes sense that you're actually spending more than you're taking in. So you can imagine it as there's two ways to think about it. One is actually governments can just print money, and this is all a big game that we play. And what we want to do is move the money creation out of the financial sector to some degree and into the private sector, into the public sector. And when the government borrows money, there's actually money creation happening. So, a bank or somebody loans to the government. They are then supported by the Federal Reserve, which, just creates reserve accounts out of nothing. That money is sort of created by the state corporate complex and then pumped into the economy. You can just say that the debts not only deficits are good and debt doesn't matter because you can always pay it off if it's in your own currency. The actual issue is inflation. That's the one you've got to watch out for, right? But the other way of thinking about it is you could balance your budget across years. So what you spend in 2020 is what you want to be taking back in taxes in 2030. Is a less radical version of that. So that which is how it works in businesses. Your investment now is based on what you project you'll be able to earn a little bit down the road, right? And as long as you're growing, that's okay. And we want the economy to keep growing ad infinitum, and we want every generation to be better off than the last.
Yes.
So long as we can decouple that from, damaging environmental consequences.
Yeah.
So I'm just pushing back a little bit on the idea of that we even worry about how we pay for a UBI. What you worry about is not how you pay for it, it's what happens once you do. Once you put that money into the economy, does it have an inflationary effect because not enough people are working? So then the amount of productivity drops. And so what consumer monetary theory suggests is that you have what's called a calibrated basic income, which means you go as high as you can without causing inflation, more or less. You start out low and you sort of feel your way towards it. In the context of the coronavirus, you may not want to do that because there's such a massive economic contraction. You kind of want to ramp it in quickly. But what I'll also add is as you approach the at which you're starting to experience inflation, you can adjust the other levers so that the Federal Reserve can or the central bank can raise interest rates and stop pumping money into the private sector quite so dramatically. So and that allows more headroom, or you can increase taxes in certain areas and suck money out of the economy that way, and that creates more inflationary headroom, if you will, to raise the basic income to a livable amount. Then you come to the issue of will people work? And I mean that's I think they probably would, but I also think that we have to get past the idea that they should. Right, that we should all love work. I don't agree with that.
Well, I think that I also agree with that, and I think that you look at that there are so many people who are actually not suitable or not able to work in various ways. They're not just people who have disabilities. They may be people who have illnesses. They may be, people of age. There are some people with mental illnesses that are not necessarily major mental illnesses, but the stress of actually having to work makes them worse. So,
Or I might add, they could have the mind of Einstein
oh
and
yeah,
be working to themselves to death in a sweatshop somewhere, right? How much is humanity lost by pushing people into the work that's immediately available? UBI allows people to transition between jobs. It allows them to seek training, and it allows them to work outside the paid economy in what I would call self-directed labor.
yeah,
So self-directed, I mean, first of all, we've got also, the volunteer firefighters, right? That's who just, saved, how many millions and millions of dollars worth of property and lives and communities were just saved by a volunteer force, right? So people, yes, will work and do important stuff for free outside of the paid economy. But I think there's also, there's an issue here where it's not just that you're supposed to work, and this has always been the hard thing for me with employment, right? You're not just supposed to do the work; you're supposed to pretend you like it. You're not supposed to pretend. You're supposed to like it. We're really, and so it's this thing you hear it from all kinds of people. Stephanie Kelton, who's the major MMT advocate and an architect of the jobs guarantee, when she's defending it, she was saying, if you're just getting money and you're sitting at home and you have nothing to do, you're going to be depressed and you're going to be lonely and you're going to be all these things, which I think you actually get from having a job that you don't like, right? And that's what makes you depressed and makes you feel isolated, because you're pretending to be somebody you're not. So we can't even admit, first of all, there's levels to it. First, we've got to admit that work is undesirable, at least for the person who's doing it. That the reason we want work done should be because there's a result at the end that somebody desires, that we want the product of the work is what's valuable, not the work in and of itself. And I don't think we even make that distinction now. So I view work as at best, a necessary evil, yes, rather than a good in and of itself.
Look, I do agree with you. I'm very lucky in that I got into two areas some years ago that I really love. And one is being a marriage celebrant. So obviously all that work fell away in this time. And the other was disability support work, which is, it's not, I don't have a lovely office to work out of. I don't have secretaries and, all that sort of, the old image of success. But I love working with the people I work with, and sometimes it can be a bit messy, sometimes it can be a bit awkward and so on, but, I love it. I probably will keep doing it for quite some time. So I'm lucky. But I noted in that article, and I haven't mentioned the article that you wrote, which kind of was a step back into journalism for you on UBI.
That's another story.
Yeah. Now,
which article in particular? Because I've written about three since this coronavirus happened.
Okay.
I did relapse into writing blogs, at least about universal basic income and the ways to fund it and so on like that.
Why this isn't the MMT moment is the one that I was looking at, the modern monetary theory moment. And in the subhead, you say a job guarantee won't work, a universal basic income will. But the point I wanted to just highlight out of that, and I will put a link to your blog, also in the footnote. But you quote that author who wrote, an insignificant series of books. Would you like to mention that? And she was on welfare at the time. Welfare. She was on welfare.
Oh yes. Yes, I can't remember her name now, but the woman who wrote the Harry Potter books.
J.K. Rowling.
Yeah, wrote the Harry Potter books while she was on a parenting payment. She was working part-time. She was working a few hours a week as a typist at a church where she could bring her kid along. Yeah. And, that's where we got this, what must be a multi-billion-dollar franchise by now, And let's not just talk about the jobs and the wealth that it created. That's just a shadow of the joy that it brings to millions. I hate the books, can't stand it. Personally, I'm not a fan. But what it is a demonstration of, that this person, if there'd been a jobs guarantee in place, she would have been put to work. Her kid would have had to go to childcare while she went to go work at a childcare center or something like that, or in some other place that they would give her some kind of job. We wouldn't have Harry Potter. And there's much more dramatic examples. Newtonian physics was something that Newton literally, famously came up with sitting under a tree, as they say.
Yep.
Whether or not he was sitting under the tree, he certainly wasn't getting paid. There were no physics departments.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
He had to invent that. Right? And the universities, as we imagine them now, grew out of the leisure activities of the gentleman class, of the upper classes, right? So out of leisure, great things come. Out of undirected, and there's even a term for this in a friend of mine just did I think it was a master's or a PhD or something in education, and they were talking about the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. If you're motivated by something that's apart from the task itself, you won't, if that task is cognitively difficult, you won't perform as well as someone who's just doing it for the love of it. The person who is just interested in the task and doing it out of interest will outperform the person who's doing it because they want the reward at the end. I mean, it's kind of obvious when you think about it, right? That the person who's interested in physics is going to do better physics than the person who's interested in money.
Yeah.
Right. And, but what we do is we prevent people from following their intrinsic interests, and we quickly redirect them towards something else and make them an instrument of somebody else's, normally of an institutional system. To be useful, you have to be validated by an institution. If what you're doing isn't earning money, it's not real. If you're and it's only by being paid for it do you know that what you're doing isn't sort of a silly nonsense behavior.
Yes.
And we see that, and that robs us of a lot. See, what I said before is that work is a necessary evil at best. Well, at worst, it's not necessary. It's just evil.
Yeah.
Right. And there's a lot of that work going on now that I don't think we need to be doing. If you start from the idea that you don't want to maximize work. So MMT, for example, just as a counterpoint to CMT and my perspective, it says, well, we know when the economy is working at full capacity because everyone's employed. Full employment equals full economic output, which I think is entirely misguided. First of all, what you're doing then is you're taking a potential J.K. Rowling, somewhere out there, you're taking these breakthrough minds and you're getting them to pave roads. And now you might say, oh, well, we need the roads. And it's like, well, why do we need the roads? We need the roads so people can get to work, right? So once there's a beer can effect with work, there's two levels at which there's a beer can effect is what NASA calls the problem of lifting all the fuel. So you put in your payload, your Dragon capsule that's about to go up in a couple of days into space with some astronauts on it, and then you put the fuel that you need to lift that underneath it.
Yeah.
Then you need to put fuel underneath that to lift the fuel, and then you need to put fuel underneath that to lift the fuel, and so on and so forth, right? Yeah. And that's why it becomes a beer can, which is light when it's empty and heavy when it's full, right? But we have the same effect with work. So the more people are going to a job in the city, the bigger the freeway needs to be. The bigger the freeway needs to be, the more concrete we need. The more concrete factories we need, the more steel we need. The more steel we need, the more coal we need, or energy we need. The more energy we need, the more power plants you've got to build. And so there's this lateral beer can effect, and also at the individual level. Because having a job is expensive. You have to pay for petrol. Yeah. You buy food out that you would have cooked at home. You have to get childcare that you might not have needed. You have, even your housing cost is inflated by the job because you have to live near where your job is. You can't go to the cheapest available house. So there's a beer can effect, which means that a job is expensive. That's what we call the individual sort of vertical beer can effect. And then there's another beer can effect where your job requires other people to do work to facilitate it. The Uber driver is going to get you there. And so there's a sideways beer effect, which is work begets work.
Yes.
And
yes.
so on and so forth. And that's why we're all so bloody tired all the time. Because
Well,
we're not trying to not be tired.
It is so interesting that this virus and the lockdown and so on has demonstrated to us something that people have talked about for decades, and that is working from home. And in so many areas, it actually has worked really well. I have a son and a daughter-in-law. The daughter-in-law is an accountant. My son is a lawyer. They've both been working from home, and it's been really successful. Work's been getting done and so on. I wonder if anybody's ever done any costings on how much money a government spends not to spend money. How much money is spent on not spending money? For example, Centrelink is a perfect example, because the concept of Centrelink is to exclude, not to include. So you're trying to work out how to exclude people who are going to come knocking on the door for help. And yet the point that you've just talked about jobs, and there are, as I said, I'm a very lucky person because I work in an area that I love. But there are lots of people who work in menial work or whatever that they hate, and in very awful situations. And yet we now have the Prime Minister today will be announcing about, we have Job Seeker, we have Job Keeper, and what we now have is a planned Job Maker scheme, which is unveiled against a backdrop of grim economic predictions, including a record deficit, debt exceeding 30% of GDP, unemployment around 10%, and a fall in foreign investment by up to 40%. Now, this is the interesting point that I just want to raise out of that. Australians will be warned by Mr. Morrison, it might be happening as I'm speaking, that these difficult times are not the product of economic failure, but a global health pandemic. And he's going to warn companies to get off the medication of handouts like JobKeeper by declaring at some point you've got to get your economy out of ICU. It's an approach that has been to workers that is now to businesses, which is saying, you guys don't know how to run your businesses. You're running cafes or restaurants or pubs or whatever. You need to be pumped to get back to work, and we need to tell you, and we need to give you a cane and a carrot and a stick to make you get back to work. We probably need to bring this to a close, Austin, but it's been really interesting talking. And
before you go,
ahead.
I want to add a couple of things. You mentioned the government debt there was going to be 30% of GDP.
Yep.
Right, and that's a problem. While you were saying that, I was looking something up. Australian household debt is projected to trend around 125% of GDP in 2021.
Yes.
And 126% of GDP in 2022.
Yeah.
Now that's just the first Google result that I get, but I knew it would be something like that. I knew it would be greater than 100%.
Yeah.
So household and private debt is the issue we need to be focused on, not government debt. That's this is what's going to kill us. And on a broad, I'd just say one more thing. So what, in a sense, obviously there's a problem with coronavirus that's happening, but as I said, I think it's accelerating transitions which were already underway. Now, what I want just, I hope you don't mind me finishing with a little bit of an analogy.
Yep.
Imagine that a group of prehistoric Neolithic children were isolated. Their parents, all the grown-ups of the group, were wiped out, and they had no idea how childbirth worked. Mm-hmm. Right, and they grow up, and naturally things occur, and they all start having sex, and then one of the young women gets pregnant.
Yep.
Right, they would think she was dying.
Yeah.
They would think, oh my God, there's a parasite. There's something terribly wrong. There's a creature inside her that's going to kill her, and this crisis would get worse and worse and worse. And only when it came to its to its catastrophic seeming climax, would they understand what was happening and that new life was being created? And I believe that that's what's going on now. And what Morrison sees as the economy collapsing and going into the ICU is actually the economy, a new kind of economy being born, one which won't be organized around a narrow, sort of a cruel and disciplinarian view, that what we need to worry about is these free riders and these loafers, and that people need to earn their keep. I'm going to say one more thing about a UBI. And this here, I'm really channeling an anthropologist and a philosopher rather, called Carl Wilderquist, and he argues that we are not free to be independent. We are not free. I can't just go out into the forest and build a hut and grow my vegetables. There are property rights, and there are national parks, and there is a state and corporate complex which will herd me back into society and into the monetary economy. Given that, there is no social contract which I signed, right? My freedom has been taken from me. My freedom to self-sustenance is you can't go off the grid. It's not allowed.
Yeah. So
given that, the compensation for that lack of freedom should be a universal basic income. So you at least have the option of opting out, and it's your compensation for participating in society. It's your compensation for agreeing to be part of a social construct that you didn't get to write or even opt into.
Yeah.
So I think that we have to start from the position of autonomy, and that everybody has a right to self-governance, and a UBI is a way of economically ensuring that. And I agree with you that most people will still want to contribute above and beyond just taking care of themselves.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, Austin. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and bring it on is what I say. Bring it on.
Awesome.